In a quiet ward of northern Tokyo, there is an apartment where the cockroaches simply stopped coming. Not slowed, not thinned out. Stopped. The building around it is one of the worst in the district. Neighbors describe summer nights alive with movement behind the plaster. Dark shapes pouring across the counter the instant the kitchen light snaps on. But behind one door on the 4th floor, the man who lives there has not seen a single cockroach in over a decade. He pays no exterminator. He owns no traps, no sprays, no glue boards, no foggers. When people ask what he does differently, he tells them one thing and only one thing. He keeps a single clove of garlic in the corner of every room. And then he says something that makes the question worse instead of better. He says the garlic is not there to repel the cockroaches. It is there to tell them to leave. That distinction, repel versus tell, is where tonight's story begins. Because this is not a tidy life hack you have scrolled past 100 times. It is a piece of household wisdom that has drifted quietly through Japanese homes for generations. A claim so plain it sounds like superstition, and so stubborn it refuses to die. 1 clove of garlic. No survivors. The easy thing to do is laugh. But when you actually pull the thread, the science underneath does not laugh back. It goes very quiet. And in my experience, things that go quiet exactly when you expect them to laugh are the things worth following into the dark. So tonight, we follow it from a Tokyo apartment into a mountain valley into the walls themselves. Here is the first thing you need to understand. And it is the thing the entire pest control aisle of your supermarket is built to make you forget. You do not have a cockroach killing problem. You have a cockroach conversation problem. Cockroaches are not lone invaders wandering in by accident. They are a society. A German cockroach, the small amber species behind almost every indoor infestation on Earth, never makes a decision alone. It reads the room. Literally. It tastes the air with 2 antennae carrying tens of thousands of chemical receptors, and it builds its entire sense of whether a place is safe from a language written in scent. Their droppings carry an aggregation pheromone, a chemical signature that says, in effect, others survived here. This is home. Come closer. A roach does not choose your kitchen. Your kitchen is recommended to it by the roaches that came before. And that means the war you think you are fighting is the wrong war entirely. You have been trying to kill the soldiers. The Japanese method, if the legend holds, does something far stranger. It edits the message. But to understand how a single clove of garlic could edit that message, you have to leave the apartment, leave the city, and go back to a Japan that smelled of smoke and disinfectant. In the years immediately after the Second World War, Japan's cities were a public health emergency. Housing was crowded, sanitation had collapsed, and insects moved through the rubble like a second occupation. The response was chemical and total. Streets were dusted, homes were fogged. For a brief, strange window, the smell of pesticide was simply the smell of being indoors. And it worked, the way a hammer works. But something else happened in those years that almost no history book records, because it did not happen in the cities. It happened in the villages the chemicals never reached. There is a hamlet I want you to picture, call it by the name the old accounts use, Kurayama, a cluster of farmhouses folded so deep into a valley that the nearest paved road was a full day's walk. In places like Kurayama, pest control had never been chemical. It had been inherited. These were households that had kept insects out of their food, their rice, and their walls for centuries before a single canister of powder existed, and they did it with what grew around them. Camphor, harvested from the camphor laurel and layered into chests to keep moths and beetles out of stored cloth, a real documented Japanese tradition that survives to this day. Smoke, ash, certain bitter leaves, and in a small number of these households, garlic, not eaten, placed. And here is the detail that the people who study folk traditions keep circling back to, the detail that refuses to behave. By every reasonable model, these villages should have been worse than the cities. Isolated, poor, food stored close to where people slept. In some of these households, it was not just better, it was absent. At first, nobody thought much of it. Isolated villages are clean, the reasoning went. Mountain air is dry, cold winters thin the population. All true, all reasonable. And none of it explained the households within those villages, the specific homes where the older generation followed a specific small ritual, and the homes right beside them, sharing the same air and the same winters, where they did not. The difference, the elders said, was the clove. And when asked to explain it, they did not give a chemical answer. They gave a strange one. They said a house has to be unwelcoming in a language insects can read. At first, that sounds like poetry. By the end of tonight, it will sound like a description of a mechanism. So what exactly was the clove supposed to do? To answer that, you have to know what garlic actually is, because garlic is not a vegetable so much as a chemical weapon that has been waiting dormant for something to crush it. An intact clove is almost inert. It barely smells. Inside it, kept carefully apart, sit two substances, a compound called alliin and an enzyme called alliinase. As long as the clove is whole, they never meet. But the instant the clove is cut, crushed, or bruised, the instant a cell wall ruptures, the enzyme finds the alliin, and within seconds it manufactures a brand new, violently reactive compound called allicin. That is the smell of garlic. It is the reason garlic burns your eyes, the reason it stains your fingers with scent for a full day. You are not smelling a food. You are smelling a defense system firing. Garlic evolved this trick to survive being eaten. The chemistry is, in the most literal sense, a scream, and allicin does not last. It is so unstable that within hours it begins decaying into a family of heavier, slower, longer-lived sulfur compounds, diallyl disulfide, diallyl trisulfide, and others, oily, volatile molecules that hang in still air and seep into porous surfaces like wood and plaster. These are not folklore. They are real, studied compounds, and agricultural researchers have spent decades examining them as natural insecticides and repellents because they do something to insects that they do not do to us. An insect does not breathe through its mouth. It breathes through its body, through tiny holes called spiracles lining its sides, feeding a network of tubes that carries air directly to its living tissue. There is no filter. There is no lung to hold a breath. Whatever is in the air goes straight in. And volatile sulfur compounds, in a creature small enough, are an irritant the creature cannot escape by breathing differently, because it cannot choose how it breathes at all. Now hold that fact against a cockroach's antennae, those tens of thousands of chemoreceptors, and the legend stops sounding like superstition and starts sounding like a hypothesis. To a German cockroach, a room is not a space, it is a chemical document. The crushed garlic clove, slowly bleeding sulfur compounds into still, humid air, does not need to kill anything. It only needs to overwrite the document. To rewrite Come Closer, others survived here into something a roach has no word for, but every instinct to flee from. That is the elegant version. But the legend does not stay elegant. The legend gets worse. Because the people who tell this story do not describe roaches calmly relocating. They describe something they struggle to put into words, and it is always the same image, repeated by people who have never met. They describe the roaches leaving the walls. In an ordinary infestation, a cockroach's deepest instinct is to stay hidden, to press its body against a surface, to wedge into the dark, a behavior entomologists call thigmotaxis, the love of being touched on all sides. A roach exposed in the open is a roach that has lost, and yet the accounts that cluster around this method describe the opposite. They describe roaches abandoning the safety of the wall cavity in the dead of night, moving out into open floor, into the light, away from the nest, as if the place that had always meant safe had begun, overnight, to mean something unbearable. One account has been retold so many times across Tokyo apartment buildings that its origin is long lost. A tenant, the story never keeps her name, crushed garlic behind her refrigerator on a humid August night, the kind of night when the air does not move and the heat sits on the city like a hand. She woke before dawn, and the roaches were not dead on the floor. They were gone. The nest behind the wall, she said, had emptied. No bodies, no trail, just an absence where a colony had been. And that, the absence, the silence, the missing dead, is the part that has kept this story alive for 100 years. Killing leaves evidence. This leaves a vacancy. And a vacancy is so much harder to forget. At first, nobody official believed any of it. Folk wisdom is treated correctly with suspicion. But the question never fully died. And the reason it never died is that real entomology kept brushing up against it from the side. Scientists have genuinely studied why cockroach populations vary so wildly between near-identical homes, why one apartment is overrun and the one directly above it is clean. They have genuinely documented that plant-derived volatiles can repel and disorient cockroaches, that certain sulfur compounds and terpenes interfere with the insect's chemical navigation. Nobody had to invent a conspiracy to make this interesting. The honest, unfinished state of the science is interesting enough. We know cockroaches raid their world chemically. We know garlic floods and corrupts that reading. And we do not have a clean, complete account of what a colony does when the world it has trusted suddenly turns against it. The legend rushes into that gap. And a legend that fills a real gap is very hard to kill. This is the point where the topic should run thin, and instead it widens. Because once you start asking how Japanese households quietly held the line against one creature, you find they were quietly holding the line against all of them, and the methods rhyme. Consider the rat. The same mountain households that placed garlic for insects had an entire grammar for rodents, and almost none of it involved killing. It involved removing the invitation. Food was sealed in heavy ceramic and wood, never left in the open. Gaps were packed tight, and the principle was identical to the garlic principle. You do not fight the animal, you erase the message that told the animal it was welcome. A rat, like a roach, does not invade a home so much as accept one. The folk methods understood centuries before anyone wrote it down, that an infestation is a conversation, and the winning move is to stop talking. Consider the rice field, the thing a village like Kurayama could not afford to lose. Across rural Japan, there are long traditions of protecting stored grain and standing crops with what the land provided. Pungent plants set along the borders, smoke drawn slowly through storehouses, strong scented growth planted deliberately at the edge of a field, so that the first thing an insect met was not food, but a wall of scent it did not want to cross. It is the garlic logic again, scaled up to an acre. Not a poison. A border made of smell. A field that, to the right nose, simply did not read as food. And consider the home itself, the camphor in the clothing chest, the bitter herb hung above the doorway, the seasonal deep clean that stripped a house of every crumb and every chemical trace an insect could have used to navigate its way back inside. None of these were separate tricks. They were one idea, applied everywhere. The idea was that you do not occupy a home against nature. You make the home unreadable to it. The garlic clove in the corner of the room is not a charm. It is the smallest, sharpest expression of an entire philosophy, that the most powerful pesticide is not the one that kills the most. It is the one that makes the colony decide, on its own, in the dark, to leave. But here is where the story turns, and where I have to be honest with you about how far it goes, because the legend keeps walking past the point the science can follow. The villagers, and later the apartment dwellers, did not treat the garlic as a thing you simply set down. They treated it as a thing you prepared, and the details are oddly, almost ritually specific. The clove must be crushed, never whole, and now you know why. A whole clove never fires. It must be placed low, in the corners, along the edges, because cockroaches hug walls and avoid open ground. It is said to work best on humid summer nights when the air is heavy and still and a volatile compound lingers instead of dispersing, and that too has a quiet logic, because heat and humidity genuinely change how scent moves and settles in a room. And it must be replaced often, every 2 or 3 days, the old practitioners insist, because the moment the clove dries out, the sulfur compounds are spent, and the room slowly, silently begins to read as safe again. A dried clove is not a weak weapon. It is a silent one. And a silent corner, the legend says, is an invitation being quietly reissued to whatever is still listening in the walls. The careful version of all this is genuinely reasonable. Crushed garlic in a humid, enclosed corner really would release real compounds that really do disturb a cockroach. What I will not tell you, what nobody honestly can, is that this clears a true infestation with no survivors. That phrase belongs to the legend, not to the evidence. A serious cockroach infestation is one of the most resilient living things you can have in a building. The German cockroach breeds at a frightening pace, hides deep in voids you will never see, and shrugs off pressures that would end almost any other animal. Repelling roaches and eradicating them are two different verbs, and the gap between them is exactly the gap the legend leaps over without ever looking down. The honest position is the unsatisfying one. Garlic almost certainly does something real, chemical, and worth respecting, and that something is not magic. And yet, even standing firmly on that honest ground, there is a final part of this story I cannot make comfortable, and it is the part I think about most. If a crushed clove of garlic genuinely shifts the behavior of the most successful household pest on the planet, even partially, even just enough to tip the balance, then a real question hangs over the whole thing. And it is not a question about insects. It is a question about us. Why did this knowledge stay in the mountains? Why is it everyday wisdom in one country and very nearly unheard of in most of the others? The unsettling answer is not a cover-up with shadowy men in a room. It is something duller and somehow worse. A clove of garlic cannot be patented. It cannot be branded, shelved, scaled, or sold at a margin. An entire global industry exists to solve the cockroach problem, and that industry has every reason on earth to teach you that the solution is a product, and no reason at all to teach you that the solution might already be sitting in a basket on your counter. Folk knowledge does not vanish because it fails. Sometimes it vanishes simply because nobody can make money carrying it forward. The most effective ideas are not always the ones that survive. Often the ones that survive are just the ones with someone paid to keep repeating them. There is one more thread, and it is the one that unsettles the people who study this most. It concerns timing. The old practitioners did not just say replace the clove, they said when. The crushing in the strictest households was done at dusk, never in the morning. The reasoning, passed down without explanation, was that the work happened at night, and the clove had to be at its strongest when the colony was at its most active. For a long time, this looked like pure ritual, the kind of superstition that attaches itself to any old practice. But cockroaches are nocturnal. A colony does its foraging, its scent trailing, its decision-making in the dark. Crush the clove at dawn, and its most reactive hours are spent on an empty room. Crush it at dusk, and the chemistry peaks precisely when every roach in the wall is awake and reading the air. The villagers could not have known the molecular half-life of Elysian. They simply watched for generations and noticed that dusk worked and morning did not. That is not magic. That is observation, refined by people who could not afford to be wrong. And there is the matter of the corners. Why corners specifically? and never the center of a room. Here, too, the folk instruction turns out to describe something real. Air does not move uniformly through an enclosed space. It pools. In a still room on a humid night, the corners and the low edges are where heavy, volatile compounds settle and concentrate instead of dispersing. And the corners and low edges are exactly where a cockroach travels, body pressed to two surfaces at once. The clove was not placed where it was convenient. It was placed where the chemistry would collect and where the insect would be forced to walk through it. A practitioner in one mountain household reportedly described it as setting the trap inside the hallway the guest cannot avoid. The guest, of course, was never meant to be caught. The guest was meant to turn around. What none of this resolves is the strangest recurring detail of all. The claim, repeated across unconnected accounts, that a treated room stays quiet for far longer than the chemistry alone should allow. A crushed clove is spent in days, yet households describe weeks of silence from a single placement. The honest explanation is almost certainly the dull one. A colony that relocates does not instantly return. The aggregation pheromone fades once the roaches are gone, and the room slowly stops advertising itself. The legend prefers a darker reading, that the walls themselves, the old porous plaster and timber, hold the scent the way cloth holds smoke, and keep whispering the warning long after the clove has dried to nothing. We cannot prove the darker version. We also cannot, standing in one of those quiet kitchens, entirely talk ourselves out of it. So the legend persists in the only place it ever could, in the quiet households that were never trying to sell anything. The man on the 4th floor in northern Tokyo is still there. He still crushes the clove. He still replaces it every few days. He still says the garlic does not repel the cockroaches. It tells them to leave. And maybe that is just an old man's poetry. Or maybe he has simply described, more accurately than any label on any can ever will, what a crushed clove of garlic actually does in a dark, humid corner of a room. It does not fight the colony. It rewrites the single message the colony lives or dies by. This place is safe, and lets the colony reach its own conclusion. Killing is loud. This is a whisper, and the most disturbing thing about a whisper is that, by the time you finally notice the silence it leaves behind, you will never be completely certain what was said. If something in this pulled at you, if you are now just slightly looking at the corner of your own kitchen a little differently, then you already understand why this story has refused to die for 100 years. Subscribe, because the next thing we are following is stranger still. The clue is already hidden in this video. Watch the walls, and if you know someone losing a quiet war in their own kitchen right now, send them here first. It might just change the way they think about who is really being invited in,